Welcome everyone to the Buddhist Society. It's nice to see you all here, especially on such a beautiful day. And it's our great pleasure to for me anyway, to introduce to you, some of you who don't know, Ajahn Candasiri, who ordained many years ago, after Sumedho had shortly, I think, just after, at the beginning, when Chithurst in the country was being sort of rebuilt and so on, and one of the very first of the women to ordain, and has been with us ever since, either at Chithurst, on the forest monastery in Chithurst, or at Amaravati. And she was ordained by Sumedho, Venerable Sumedho, I think, whose 90th birthday, isn't it, is celebrated this year at Amaravati. Anyway, so it's really a great joy for me to introduce you. He's sort of been with us so long, since the very beginning. And tonight, Ajahn Candasiri will be talking. Subject is precious things to remember. Precious things to remember. I should also say that Ajahn Candasiri does quite a lot of dialogue, Christian Buddhist dialogue, something that we're actually very interested in here too. I think that comes partly from your upbringing, doesn't it, as a Christian. Candasiri comes from Scotland. And they used to anyway, because my family also comes from Scotland. We used to take religion very seriously in Scotland. In fact, the kind of Christianity which my family from the Scottish side was very dour indeed. And how anyone would have wanted to have been a Christian in that atmosphere, I can't imagine. But anyway, it's a great joy for us to have you here. And the subject of tonight's talk is an exploration of the Kosambiya Sutta, and from the Majjhima Nikaya, 48 verse 6, also known as the Saraniyadhamma Sutta. And the talk is based in the light of 40 years of being an ordained nun. So thank you so much. Thank you really very much for coming.
I'll begin with a little invocation that we like to do when we give a formal Dhamma talk. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. You can hear me all right. I'm just going to get my clock. I don't want to go on for too long, see? What I'd like to suggest as a kind of start for the evening is maybe just to sit quietly, because I know that for many of you, you've travelled across London. I've travelled across London, and it's a very stimulating experience travelling across London, especially for me because I live somewhere very remote, very quiet up in Scotland. So just to take this time just to really establish ourselves in the present moment, coming to the breath, coming to the body, and just allowing the mind to settle just a little bit. I think this might be helpful. So just a couple of minutes of quiet, and then I'll begin to offer my formal presentation. Just aware of the room that we're in, aware of the situation, aware of the company, people, some of whom we know, some of whom we don't know, and our general state of being, perhaps a little bit tired, a little bit fatigued after a day of activity, and hopefully with a present sense of how the day has been, and a feeling of gladness, of pleasure at this opportunity to contemplate the teachings of the Buddha. So I realize that this is an incredibly precious opportunity to be able to come to a place like this in the middle of London, a place committed to studying and practicing according to the teachings of the Buddha. These teachings that support calm, that support clarity, that support harmony, and the well-being of humanity. When the Buddha attained to perfect enlightenment, his instruction to his disciples was to hear the teachings, receive the teachings, use the teachings in their lives, and to share their understanding of the teachings for the welfare, the blessing of gods and humans. So to have a place in a city where all kinds of other things happen is a very rare and precious situation for us, and to have people who are interested, companions on the way, is also very rare and precious. That all of you have an interest in the teachings, an interest in contemplating the teachings, practicing according to the teachings. This is something really not to be undervalued, to be celebrated. Nowadays we hear so many difficult things happening in the world, on all levels, nationally, internationally, domestically, and people going through all kinds of personal crises just because of the huge pressure that many are experiencing. And really what the world most needs is people who are committed to understanding and practicing according to these teachings. So I'm pleased to see you all here, and that we have this opportunity to take a little bit of time to contemplate this particular sutta that I chose for the framework, the structure of my talk. As you may know, we don't really prepare talks. I haven't got anything written down, but we do sometimes use a scripture as a framework. So that's what I'll be doing this evening. The teaching was given by the Buddha after a series of events in the Sangha, where the monks were living at Kosambiya, which is in India, northern India, northeastern India, and there'd been a terrible argument that had arisen between two very senior monks, one of whom was an expert on the discipline, who knew all the rules and all the observances. The discipline is quite something, I have to say. It extends to several volumes of teachings. So one was an expert on the discipline, and the other was an expert on the teachings, on the suttas. So they each had their own field of expertise, and they each had their own kind of devoted group of followers. Anyway, the expert on the teachings, on the suttas, he made a very, very small mistake to do with proper behavior in the latrine. He left some water there that he shouldn't have left there. And the expert on discipline, or one of the, I can't remember the details. Anyway, the expert on the discipline called him up about this and said, hey, you've made a mistake there, that's a transgression. You need to confess it. And so the expert on sutta said, okay, I'll confess it. He said, but if you didn't know it was a mistake, then there's no transgression. So the expert on suttas assumed that he hadn't made a mistake. Anyway, this whole thing escalated. I'm telling this story because this is something that can happen so easily among people. We have a very small mistake blown up into a huge problem, a huge incident. So the disciples of the sutta expert and the disciples of the discipline expert started to really be very unpleasant towards each other. And eventually the Buddha was invited to come and sort of help sort out the dispute. And he came, but they wouldn't listen to him. So he went away. He gave them some advice about how to deal with the problem, and went away, and they continued. And then they said, look, please come and sort this out, because if this carries on, there's going to be a schism. And the sense is that the very worst thing that can happen is to have a split in the community, because then they can't really practice together, they can't support each other, they can't learn from each other. They each go their own way, and that's considered a very unfortunate state of affairs, something to be avoided at all costs. So the Buddha once again goes and tries to convince them. But again, they wouldn't listen to him. They said, don't worry, Lord, we'll sort it out. You just go and enjoy having a peaceful time. We'll deal with this. This is our problem. They thought they could sort it out, and they were continuing. And eventually the Buddha just said, well, if that's how you feel, I'll go. There's no point me trying to convince you because you're so hard and set in your ways. I can see that it's time just to leave. So he went away, and everybody was very upset because they loved and revered him. The lay people were very upset. In fact, the lay people were so upset they stopped feeding the monks. They stopped preparing food for the monks. And actually that was the thing that really supported a kind of a very quick resolution. After that incident, the Buddha then presented this teaching, which is called, in some places it's called the Saraniyadhamma Sutta, the most precious things to be remembered. Now the reason I thought that this would be a good teaching, a good thing to share, is because it's addressing monks, but it would apply equally to nuns, and it would apply equally to society as a whole, in fact. Very useful, simple guidelines that I'd like to share with you this evening. Sometimes people think, oh, I'll go and stay in the monastery where there are all those kind and friendly monks and nuns, but where it's peaceful, I'll go and find a bit of peace. But actually, when we enter onto this path of practice, and you've probably found this yourselves, what happens is often, when we're talking about purification, often the process of purification means that some quite unpleasant things can arise. And so it's not always so peaceful and calm. Just as those monks at Kosambiya got into this terrible schism and started really being very unpleasant towards each other. Things like that can happen, even to people committed to peace and to harmony. So the Buddha said, well, these are 6 things that can really support harmony and well-being and friendliness and cooperation. So it's quite a short teaching, and the first thing that he said was our friendliness in action is ever present towards our fellows, our companions. This is a Dhamma to be remembered, to be cherished, to be held in great esteem, conducive to sympathy, to unbroken and harmonious concord. So friendliness in action, or it's also translated as loving kindness in action. So kind acts. When I was on the train today, I was very touched. I was touched for several reasons, but it was a very crowded train and I had this suitcase and I could see that the only place to put it was up on the luggage rack. And this woman sitting close to where I was going to be sitting, she didn't look much younger than me. She said, "Oh, I'll put it up." And I looked at her and I thought, "Really?" But she insisted on putting it up. Not only that, but when I sat down, she said, "Yes, and I'll take it down for you afterwards." And I thought that was a very nice gesture. But I also thought, gosh, I must look very old. So, simple things. Just gestures of kindness, friendliness, a smile. These are all things that create a pleasant atmosphere, that help us to relax. One of the reasons I think that people are mean to each other is not because they necessarily want to cause harm, but sometimes if we get tense and anxious about things, we can be easily upset by small things. And a kind gesture, a friendly, supportive gesture, can be something that can enable a sense of relaxation, a sense of friendliness. It's been interesting for me up at the hermitage where I stay in Scotland, because we have, I live in a kind of, a very spread out kind of neighbourhood. Like our neighbours, my nearest neighbour is 10 minutes walk up the hill. So that we're not close together, and in fact maybe because of that there's a real feeling of friendliness. Like when a tree fell down over the road one time, some people just came and cut it up. I mean, I didn't phone them, I didn't say I really need this to happen. They just came in the middle of the night and cut up this tree and wouldn't accept any kind of remuneration. They just said, "Well, this is what we do. We help each other out." And I have to say that this is it's very touching to experience this. And I'm sure all of you have got situations where you've received kindness, direct acts of kindness from other people. So this is the first gesture, the first Saraniyadhamma. It's the first thing to be cherished, to be remembered, to be held in great esteem, to be made much of. You know, can we do this? Can we support each other? Can we help each other in this way? Not taking advantage of one another, not cheating or lying. And just the basic 5 precepts that all of us aspire to live by. And not causing harm, not taking advantage of others. These are all ways that this can be manifested in our lives. So not to underestimate the effect of kindness, of goodness in the world. The second one is kindness or friendliness of speech, verbal acts of kindness and friendliness. I always think this is one of the most difficult precepts, to refrain from harsh or abusive ways of speech. Because our habits of speech are so deeply ingrained we'll see that it links up very closely with the third Dhamma, but I'm going to speak a little bit more about the second one to start with. I think that this one is important, both in terms of how we speak to each other and how we speak about each other. Yes. We might be very kind and polite to somebody's face when we meet them directly, but we might be very unkind behind their back. And that's always a very unfortunate way of behaving, very divisive. And if the person hears about it, then it's even worse. They feel terrible, or you feel terrible. Sometimes I've said things about somebody and then, realize that they've heard, that they know that I've said it, and you don't feel very good. So for our own well-being, as well as the well-being of others, can we be careful about how we speak to and about each other? With kindness, with friendliness. These first two of the Saraniyadhammas link very, very closely with the third one. In fact, I think the third one of this particular trio is maybe the most important. Our friendliness in thought is ever present towards our companions. Because, of course, all our actions, all of our speech arise from thought. I've got very interested in this one, I have to say, because I'm interested in being happy, actually. And one of the things that causes most unhappiness is negative thinking, negative thought. In the sutta, the word that's used for loving kindness is metta. And when we think about right intention, we think about metta, but also there's another word that's helpful, which is avera, which is non-ill will. Now, loving kindness, thinking kind thoughts about people all the time is not always possible, is it? Sometimes we're hurt. Sometimes somebody does something mean. Sometimes somebody does something really foolish. Sometimes when you kind of read the newspaper, you read about things, terrible things that people have done. And we can end up feeling very angry and very upset and very negative about other people. So how do we apply this friendliness in thought towards our friends and companions? How does this work? What do we do? Can we do it? I remember one time when I was really upset about something in the monastery, actually. Somebody had done something that was very hurtful. I was really, really hurt, really upset. And my mind went into a kind of inner tirade of all of the terrible things I wanted to have happen to that person. How I wanted them to be really punished. I really wanted them to be humiliated. And I was having quite a lot of fun with this. It was a kind of sense of glee, thinking of all of the terrible things that I wanted to have happen to this person. And it went on for a little while, and then this little voice came into my head and said, "Come on, Candasiri, this is not what the Buddha encouraged. This is not what the Buddha taught." And I knew that voice was right. And fortunately, I was able to just drop it straight away. I just stopped that kind of game I was playing And you know what happened at that point, which was a big surprise to me, was that I suddenly felt really happy. There was a feeling of real lightness and gladness in my heart. It was like magic. I realized that this negative, this vindictive, this kind of punishing, wanting to hurt somebody way of thinking was not doing me any good, and it probably wasn't doing them any good either. So it's kind of almost for our own welfare that we try to avoid generating a lot of negativity about people or about situations. It can be difficult, I think, particularly when you watch a lot of TV or read the papers, because there are some pretty unskillful things happening. Or maybe in your families, you have relatives or you know of people close to you who are doing really foolish things, and maybe you feel angry or upset or negative about them. But my encouragement would be to see if you can just drop that feeling of negativity and maybe try to consider the situation in a different way. Can you bring up a heart of compassion, a heart of kindness? You know, often when people are doing foolish, harsh, dreadful things, they're not always very happy. They're not always very at ease in themselves. They may be confused, they may be agitated, they may be frightened. I think there's an awful lot more fear in the world and in our society than we actually realize. And one of the ways we can learn about this is by looking into our own hearts and noticing the effect of fear. You know, fear of looking foolish, fear of being hurt. So to contemplate how might it have been for that person? What might have motivated them to do what they've done? You know, people usually act in ways because they want to feel better, they want to feel happy, they want to feel well, they want to feel strong and successful because they're afraid of failing. When I think of somebody who's maybe done something foolish in that way, then rather than wanting to blame and punish, what's much more likely to arise is a sense of concern, you know, a wise and loving concern. You know, how can I support that person? How can I help that person to see the situation in a different way? I do this for my own welfare, and I also do it for their welfare. So in community, in families, there are always going to be times when people have disagreements, when people have misunderstandings, confusions, see things differently. You know, so many situations, so many impossible situations where these kind of things can arise. So it can be interesting to notice where our mind kind of automatically goes to. Do we go to blaming and judging and criticizing and wanting to punish? Or can we turn it around and think rather, you know, how can I help? How can I support clarity and understanding? How can I help people to really appreciate the effects of what they're doing, of what they're saying, of their attitudes? It's a very subtle kind of patient work. We were talking about this on the way here, about a situation where, you know, it's troubling, it's difficult, and how can we best support some clarity, some understanding? Not by yelling or behaving in a harsh or abusive way, not by allowing ourselves to dwell in states of negativity, but rather through contemplating our own pain, our own difficulty, our own feeling of hurt or upset, bringing a sense of kindness, a sense of compassion to ourselves, and from that place allowing the Brahmaviharas to arise. They always start here. It's interesting. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's very difficult to be kind to somebody if we're not kind to ourselves. Very difficult to be compassionate to somebody if we're not compassionate with ourselves. You know, how many people have been in situations where maybe you've been with someone who's sick or dying, and you want to say the right thing, you want to do the right thing, you want to be helpful, you don't want to say the wrong thing. There's a feeling of tension, of anxiety. So, okay, Candasiri, you don't want to hurt that person, you don't want to make things worse. Okay, you want to do something good and kind. So just bringing a sense of compassion to oneself, and from that, there's a natural sense of presence and the capacity to respond in the best possible way. So, to recap so far, thoughts of kindness, not allowing ourselves to dwell in states of aversion or negativity towards one another. However foolish somebody might have been, this doesn't mean that sometimes we're not firm. You know, sometimes the kindest thing is to be rather firm, rather clear with someone. You know, do you realize that that's a really harmful thing that you've just done? Could have been much more serious. Maybe you need to think about that. So sometimes we have to be rather stern. But we're not doing it from a place of wanting to punish or hurt or make somebody feel foolish, but more out of a concern for their welfare. So thoughts of kindness, of non-ill will, words of kindness, of non-ill will, actions of kindness or non-ill will. Very, very important, very beautiful qualities that the world greatly needs at this time. It greatly needs those, it greatly needs people who have a sense of peacefulness and lightness and joy. And these are things that arise naturally when we bring forward thoughts of kindness, actions and speech of kindness, rather than being harsh or abusive with one another. And this can promote a sense of ease and a sense of happiness in our society, in our families, in our communities. The fourth factor is the willingness to share. So the way it's worded is very much for us as monastics. So it's something like, in whatever one receives as due offerings, whatever one receives as due offerings, even to the contents of one's bowl, one's alms bowl, one does not make use of them without sharing them with virtuous fellow monks or nuns. So how do we interpret that for everybody else, for in our society? Well, the willingness to share. If somebody needs something, we're willing to share it with them, to give it to them. If they need it, can we do that? Or do we have to just keep everything for ourselves, amass more and more wealth for ourselves? Are we willing to share? Are we willing to share our resources and to encourage other people to do the same? This is a very beautiful quality, rather than the fear that someone's going to steal from us, and take what we have. Instead of that, can we share? Can we cultivate an open heart, an open home, so we can share what we have, share our shelter, share our food? Can we do that? There's a wonderful story about one of the Buddha's relatives who became a monk just very shortly after the Buddha's enlightenment. I can't quite remember what his name was. It might have been Badia. And there were quite a few of the Buddha's relatives joined the Sangha very shortly after the Buddha was enlightened. And this monk, he'd been quite a powerful ruler, very wealthy, powerful ruler in his own right. And he was meditating off in the forest. And some of the other monks, his companions, they got a bit concerned because there were all kinds of strange sounds coming from this monk. And they thought, oh dear, is he all right? So they went to the Buddha and said, well, we're really worried about him. Maybe you need to go and talk to him. It sounds as though he's in difficulty. So the Buddha went to this monk and said, your companions are really concerned about you. What's the matter? Are you all right? Do you want to leave? Is something troubling you? Are you thinking about how it was when you were a ruler? Do you want to go back to the household life? Do you want to go back to your palace? And he said, no, just such a state of bliss. It's just so wonderful. Because now I have nothing. I have nothing. Whereas before I had all these possessions, I had these palaces, I had all these people I was responsible for, I had all these gates and places that I had to guard, all this gold bullion stored up, all of these, and I was always, I could never trust anybody because I always thought people were going to come and steal my wealth. But now I have nothing. I've given it all up. And I like that story. Because I mean, for most of us, that's not realistic. Of course, you can't just give away everything. You need some money to buy food. You need some kind of shelter. You need a certain amount. But we have this lovely thing of the 4 requisites. How much do you need? How much food do you need? How many clothes do you need? How much shelter do you need? What kind of medicines do you need? Do you really need all of the things that you have? Or can you give some of them away? I don't know if they have lots of charity shops in London. We have a wonderful charity shop up in Comrie. And it's absolutely full of great things for people to buy. Because people are generous, they give away their things. In fact, when they had a kind of, they were collecting clothing for refugees, and they filled 2 or 3 huge lorries to drive to across Europe to one of the countries where they needed warm clothing. And that was very lovely. So considering what can I give away, what can I get rid of, what can I share, is a good practice. And it brings joy to be able to give something to somebody who needs it. And it certainly is very lovely for them to receive something that they don't have, that maybe you can give them. So cultivating a generous heart. Number 5 is about precepts, really, about having a kind of a structure, a kind of code of practice that you follow. So as Buddhists, we have the 5 precepts, refraining from deliberately causing harm, refraining from stealing or cheating, taking what is not given, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from wrong speech, harsh or abusive speech, refraining from intoxication. These are 5 basic guidelines, deceptively simple, and quite challenging, is my sense, because on a good day you might think, well, of course, this is obvious. But when you're under pressure, it's not always so obvious. When you really want something, or when you're really upset or angry about something, it can be very easy if we don't take these quite seriously, if we don't have them firmly in place as a guide for our lives, as a structure for our lives. It can be very easy just to slip off into something that is perhaps regrettable. So having this kind of structure that, in a way that we share. So as I said, it's a teaching that's given to monks and nuns. And so we have a very clear, very explicit form that we undertake to train by. But equally, as a layperson, there is this structure, this form. And so holding this in common, taking it seriously, is a great support, because it's not easy. And we need good friends. So knowing that we have friends who are also striving to live according to these guidelines is a great blessing, a great support, and brings a real feeling of fellowship. It means that we have to acknowledge that life is difficult. We have to acknowledge to each other that we have weaknesses, we have vulnerability. You know, you might think, well, of course, 5 precepts, nothing much, simple, you know, beginner's stuff. But when you actually take them seriously, try to live with them, you know, I'll bet there are times when it's not so simple, not so easy, because, you know, things come up. As I said at the beginning, purifying the heart, it's sometimes a rather messy business. Because when you're purifying something, you have to get rid of, you have to allow the acknowledgement to allow into the surface the things that are less pure, that are less beautiful. So having companions who understand and who can support us and who are not going to judge us and criticize us and make us feel foolish is a great blessing. A real support, and it supports everybody. So we're not just some oddball doing this strange practice that nobody really understands, or a goody-goody. It's not like that. It's a very exacting training. And I think sometimes people are surprised when they hear about, you know, monastic life. You know, sometimes I talk about difficulties in the community and how I can be completely enraged if somebody puts their sitting cloth 2 inches too far forward. I think, she thinks she's senior to me. And you can get really upset. And this is atta, this is the sense of selfhood arising, this atta that we need to understand. You know, you might think, well, of course, I shouldn't have a personality. I know, and I shouldn't have attachments. Well, yes. But you don't not have attachments just because you don't want to have attachments. Just because you've read the teachings, you've heard the teachings, and you can quote the teachings. When you put the teachings into practice, you see, well, you have to work with these things. You have to acknowledge these things. You know, every one of the Buddha himself and every one of his disciples, they started life. They weren't pure to start with. You know, they had desires. They had difficulties in getting along together. They had arguments and quarrels and all kinds of things, as we know. But they were willing to acknowledge them, and they were willing to work with them. And the more we do that, and the more we recognize, and the more we apply ourselves, the more we realize it's difficult. And so we can support each other with kindness, not judging or blaming or criticizing or trying to prove that we're better than somebody else, but saying, yeah, I know it's really difficult. It can be really hard. The final of these Saraniyadhammas is preserving the insight that is noble and liberating and leads those who act upon it to the utter destruction of ill, utter destruction of suffering. How about that? What is this insight? Insight into the Four Noble Truths. The truth of suffering, the truth of the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering. Understanding that, understanding the fact that we suffer, or being willing to acknowledge that we suffer, to recognize there is suffering right now, to understand why we're suffering right now, because of wanting something, attaching to that desire, to appreciate the cessation of suffering when we let go of that desire. Like with me, with that person who I was upset about, you know, I was gleeful, I was having fun thinking negative thoughts, but it was a kind of suffering. It wasn't a peaceful, pleasant state. And then just dropping it. Letting go of that desire to hurt or to harm. And experiencing the cessation of suffering. That peace, that happiness that all of us can experience when we let go of desire. And then picking up the Eightfold Path in our lives. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Or Sila, Samadhi, Panya. How we live our lives, how we can gather our minds, focus our minds through meditation, And through that meditation, through that calm, collected mind, we can observe the nature of our existence. We can observe how things arise and cease and change, and how nothing in the world of conditions is something that we can lay claim to as being me or mine. Letting go. Letting go. At the end of this little list of Saraniyadhammas, the precious qualities, there's another translation which is principles of cordiality, which I find much less appealing. So these beautiful, these precious qualities, they say that the most important is this last one: right view, right understanding, that everything that arises ceases and is not who and what we are, essentially. Cultivating this path to liberate the heart from suffering, living carefully and responsibly, collecting, gathering the mind, and really seeing into the nature of reality. This is what can free us from suffering. So a quick recap, and then if there are any questions, we can have a time for some questions. So, firstly, maintaining acts of friendliness, of kindness, bodily acts, maintaining verbal acts of kindness and friendliness, maintaining thoughts of friendliness and kindness, sharing what we have, cultivating or using a structure to support basic ethical qualities in our lives that support real happiness, real well-being, and cultivating and living according to a perfect understanding of how things are. Little by little, just this can lead us to the ending of suffering, can help us to understand suffering, can help us to understand how to end suffering. So I wish for each one of you perfect liberation from all suffering as quickly as possible. And may we support each other in this very wonderful practice. So.
Sorry, would you mind telling me the name of the teaching? There was a title, right?
Yes, the Kosambiya Sutta is in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 48.
Okay.
And it's within that. So the actual sutta is longer, but the particular teaching I picked was from verse 6 of the Kosambiya Sutta. You can Google it, I'm sure.
I will.
Yes. It actually appears in other suttas as well, and I can't remember what the other sutta was that it's in.
Take a picture.
Maybe somebody else knows. Any scholars here?
It was a really bad picture, so.
Do you need the sheet of paper again?
There's more downstairs, but
Yeah.
thanks.
If anybody has any questions or comments, I don't know if the Zoom people can ask questions or comment.
Yes, they certainly
If they can
can.
raise their hand or send a chat message. Yes.
If I can share an experience from years ago, I used to go out and get a sandwich for lunch and then sit by the river and eat it. And this, I suppose you call it a beggar or whatever, came up and said, can you give me a couple of quid? I said, what for? You need something to eat? He said, yes, he lied. And so I said, fine, have half of my sandwich. Oh, he said, I can't eat that, I'm a vegetarian. It was a ham sandwich.
Oh dear, oh dear. So he went away disappointed.
So yeah, he went away confused.
Yes,
I
yes.
was somewhat amused.
I had an experience this week where I got really upset with someone who I thought was sort of telling me what to do. And then a couple of hours later, so you know, I went for a walk, I was upset. I went for a walk, and a couple of hours later I had a meeting and I realised that she was really stressed out.
Ah,
And you know, and I was just sort of in the receiving end.
yeah, yeah,
And it really, it's not the first time that I'm really aware that it's really hard sometimes to separate
yeah,
and to go, actually, that person maybe not okay at the moment, you know. You just can feel like it's to do with you.
yeah.
you
That's
know.
why it's really important to have compassion for yourself first.
Mm.
I talk sometimes about making sure that you have an inner ouch.
Mm.
Just acknowledge the hurt. And then after you've done that, then there's the capacity to attune to what they might be experiencing. Yeah, but it sounded as though you did the compassionate thing. You went for a walk, which was something that you needed to do.
Yeah, out of this,
Yes.
yeah, that
So you-
particular context, just for,
Yeah,
yeah.
very good, yes. Yeah, somebody compares it to like on an aeroplane, the announcement, you know, always adjust your own oxygen mask before helping others with theirs. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a nice example. Because as soon as you tune into their suffering, you immediately, yeah,
Yeah, it's not a problem for me anymore.
you can drop it.
Yeah, I can
You're
have a
hurt.
different,
Yeah, yeah.
reaction.
But you have to feel your hurt first, and then you can.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you almost you feel it. The
Mm.
tension
Yeah.
is in you.
Yeah,
It has nothing to do with you, but yet you actually, and you feel it in your body as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we're all connected.
We are definitely all connected. Yeah. But I thought maybe with practice it get easier to realize when it's nothing to do with you.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. We attune. I always see practice like getting to know yourself. It's like meditation. It's just like, you know, taking time each day. You know, maybe just 10, 15 minutes, or however long you can spare. Taking time each day just to get to know yourself. You know, to watch your own mind, to listen to the kind of things that are going through it, the kind of concerns and troubles, and try to receive it with a kind and friendly heart rather than saying, I should snap out of this, I shouldn't be feeling like this. Well, maybe you shouldn't, but you are. So, yeah.
You can have bad thoughts towards yourself as well, right? And bad words.
Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to really watch out for those. Yeah. Yes.
I'd like to ask if you could share a little bit of what you wrote in the book, the Buddhism and Women.
Of what I wrote in the book.
Or what was
I don't think.
Yes, there is a talk in here that I gave, or an article I wrote, but I haven't actually read it yet. So I don't quite know what I said.
It's a very beautiful article.
Oh, thank you. I can tell you what it's called. My Life as a Nun.
About the sort of dispute at the very beginning,
Yes.
it's interesting because, you know, in the Zen tradition, it's very strict, the discipline side of
Yes.
it.
Mm.
You know, but a lot of people mistake, they think it's all about discipline,
Mm.
you know, and And then there are those, also, I would have to say, within our tradition, who are just full of ideas, They've read something from the sutras, and they're full of opinions. But the Buddha's answer was, of course, was the middle way, wasn't it? About awareness, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's such a beautiful. Thank you very much. Such a wonderful talk. And those things often are in kind of fighting each other. The discipline side of it. I must get the discipline right, And then you see people, especially Zen people anyway, they're kind of full of their own discipline, they're kind of rigid almost, because they've been doing so much practice, physical practice. But there's no content, the heart is still not there. Anyway, it's a lovely talk, because it brings one down to the real things that matter, the precious things to remember. Surely there's another question or comment.
I was reflecting on the 5 things that you said. It sort of falls into the Brahma Vihara and the Eightfold Path, because the kindness is the Brahma Vihara and is right thought. And then generosity is like action and done, and then the virtuosity and like leaves for mental cultivation. So these are almost like the Eightfold Path with the Brahma Vihara and the precious things and cultivating.
I mean, that's the thing about Buddha's teachings. They're all kind of teachings within teachings within teachings. I mean, it'd be possible probably to speak for several weeks, just sort of leading from one thing to the other, going into great detail in the Eightfold Path, and then that leads on to the right efforts, and then to right intentions, and then different kinds of, each of the factors of the path, and then, yes, the 37 Bodhipakya Dhammas and the enlightenment factors and all the rest of it. It all connects up.
That's the beauty.
Yes. It can be a little bit confusing because sometimes the lists don't quite match. But I think one has to remember that he was teaching over a period of 45 years. So his enlightenment was at the age of 35 and he lived till he was 80. And so he was traveling around and teaching, meeting with people in very, very different circumstances. So he talked to kings and emperors and rulers and prostitutes and beggars and people who were really sick, and then the people who became monks or nuns. So he was giving his teaching on many different occasions. And then the really kind of conceited people who would come, who try to make him look foolish and defeat him in a debate. And he was kind of just up for all of it. He'd have an appropriate response for each situation. Often with humour. I quite like that the Buddha, he wasn't... I mean, sometimes people think, well, an enlightened being, no personality. But it's not that he didn't have a personality, but that he wasn't attached to his personality. I think that's a really important thing, because it ties up a little bit with what you were saying about how sometimes you can be just so serious because you're trying to get rid of your personality and get everything just right. But if you look at the teachings, if you read the suttas, you find that the Buddha was he had a kind of wicked sense of humour sometimes. He was very much alive and incredibly attuned. So there were, sometimes some of the stories are heartbreaking stories about things that happened to people. And he could attune to that. He could respond to whatever was needed. And then when the monks and nuns made mistakes, he'd say, "You foolish monk, you foolish nun. This does not arouse faith. Rather, it undermines faith. It harms the faith of the faithful." So always the encouragement, the support for people, whatever their situation. Right up to we had our Wesak festival a couple of days ago at Milne Hume, and it was a very touching story at the time of his death, and he was saying, does anyone have a question? And the monks were all, it was just the monks who were gathered around. I don't know where the nuns were, but anyway, the monks were all gathered around, and 500 of them, it says, and they were all completely quiet. And he said, "Well, okay, maybe one of you's maybe you have a question, but you're shy. Don't want to ask it. So if you're shy and don't want to ask it, why don't you just ask a friend and they can ask on your behalf?" And this was as he was dying, you know, to be able to have that sense of kindness. But none of them had any questions because they all were quite clear in their practice and they understood the teachings. But it was little things like that are very, very touching, I find. And finding ways just to encourage and yeah.
I thought that the point you made about sharing was a very good one. And it reminded me, you know, when I was with my own teacher, and she said to me, "I think, Desmond, you should give a talk." And I thought, I couldn't possibly give a talk. I just couldn't do it, you know. So she said, "Well, how long have you been practicing here?" And I thought, I had to think about it. It was probably about 10 years or something. He said, "You mean after all this time you got nothing to say about what you've been doing?"
Yes, sharing Dhamma.
Yes, it can be extremely hard because you know,
Yes.
who am I to share the Dhamma? And you know, the way you describe it, it's the simplest thing, isn't it? It's a simple, natural thing. It's the things you've spoken about. And of course, they're the most difficult things to share, actually, or to convey. I mean,
Difficult things to do.
and to do. Yes. Nothing online. Well, can I thank you for a lovely talk, inspiring talk. Thank you. And can I wish you a happy, safe journey home as well.
Well, we'll be going to Amaravati now, which
Very
is
good.
not quite home now,
Not-
but yeah, we're going to be having a weekend of celebration of Ajahn Sumedho's 90th birthday. His birthday is not actually until July, but because the time of his birthday falls during Vasa, and they wanted to invite monks from all over the world. And during Vasa, they can only be away for 6 nights at a time. So they decided to have it in May, and so they could come for a longer visit. So they'll be touring around all the other monasteries. So,
Is Ajahn Sumedho going to be at Amaravati in July?
I think so. Yes, I think he'll be there. I think so, as far as I know.
I mean, can one go, or does it have to be, is it by ticket or by special?
For the weekend, you mean?
I mean, yes, can one?
I'm sure you can go. I mean, there's no guarantee that you'll have a place actually in the temple, which is where some of the things will be happening, because they only have space for 500. But it'll be relayed. Yes, so I think they're expecting quite a lot of people. It's going to be combined with the Wesak festival at Amaravati. On Sunday will be the Wesak, and the kind of main event around Ajahn Sumedho's 90th birthday.
Yes.
It'll be sort of paying of respects and that kind of
Yes.
thing. Dhamma talks. I think it begins on Friday evening with talks, and then Saturday talks, and then Sunday talks. Yes.
Well, now you know. We have ours, by the way, on Saturday here, our Wesak celebration.
Ah, yes, yes. Good. Good.
Well,
Yes.
thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes.